Hello everybody, I hope you're safe and well. Today I wanted to talk to you about the way in which I draw buildings and capture them in my illustrations. I'm often commissioned to draw buildings, and so I just wanted to focus on the sorts of approaches that I take and the things I think about. So to start with, I just wanted to give you a couple of examples. This is the front cover of a book called The Ever Open Door, which I was commissioned to do for the Together Trust last year. And this was done from an existing building from life in Manchester. And this was just colour first, as you can see. And then I'll just show you an ongoing commission actually, where I've been commissioned by a developer to do a series of drawings of a mill that is being renovated, and this is one of the pieces. I've got quite a few to do from different angles, and again all of them are done colour first. They want something that's looks a little bit different to traditional pen and ink. And then this one is an ongoing one. I haven't finished it yet because of the fact that certain details of the building were still being agreed. So the colour first has gone in, the framework that I can put in has gone in, but the rest of it is still to be done. So I just thought that would be a sort of a useful sort of start point really. What I want to do is actually talk to you and give one example just to show you some of the things I think about. This is the example I want to talk about, and this is somewhere local to me. I want to go through some of the key things I think about when I'm drawing and painting buildings. So I'll put that to this side, and then I'm going to just put this here. And if you can just focus in on the middle, there are three things actually that I can think about. I think about the shapes that the building and the negative shapes, around the building, the shapes that are formed. You can see this is very strong on this picture here. As well as the actual building itself and the other areas. So the shapes and the volumes are really important. The reason that's important actually is because you don't want to create a drawing that looks like it's a flat cardboard cutout. You want to create something that has volume. And by looking carefully at the shapes and the edges together with the shapes, then that helps you to do that, and we'll go through that. And then the next thing I want to talk about is the edges. So all of these edges of all of the building and actually the surroundings as well are something that I kind of focus on when I'm drawing. And I think you'll have probably seen my contour drawing video, which came out a couple of weeks ago. If not, you can see it on my YouTube. But I'm very fond of this type of drawing. One of the reasons for that is that it is a really lovely way of, without having to measure and get too caught up with some technical details, it's a lovely way of capturing the essence of whatever it is, buildings being one thing. And what you're doing, just to remind you, is you're following carefully around the edge with your eye, and as you do that your pen is going down on the paper, and you can do it as a single line, as multiple lines of different things. But what I mean by that is you can just try and keep your pen on the page and do it as a line around the edge, or you can put you take your pen off and on, so you don't get the kind of crossover effect. But I quite like that. I quite like the flow that you get by doing a continuous line contour, as I call it. So anyway, that's the edges. But the great thing about going around the edges is that automatically, if you're being careful, you do automatically start to get the ratio of the things in proportion without actually having to measure them. So that's one of the advantages. Another thing about it is that by doing a drawing of all of the edges, you start building up this 3 dimensions on the page, which I said was really important when you're doing buildings. You don't want it to look flat. You want it to have all of these angles, so that it actually has the effect of looking as though it has volume and depth, which is really important. So that's the first two things. And then the third thing I wanted to just briefly mention is measures. I do measure when I am creating a drawing, because I want to make sure that I get the proportions right. So on this this view, I will be looking at the relative proportions of the key aspects of the building and the surroundings. So here you can see that the background there and everything is equal to that, which is equal to that. So that's a third, I would say a third, a third, a third, and a bit left over. And then equally, in terms of a third, it's more like a half, isn't it, where that kind of goes up to. So you're just sort of using your hand to kind of gauge. An outstretched arm is what you want. So you need to lock your elbow if you're measuring to get the proportions about right. I mean, it doesn't have to be 100% accurate, and you don't want to kind of get too caught up with measuring, but it's just useful to think about it. The other thing, so we're now talking a little bit about perspective. It's not absolutely critical, but one thing that's useful to think about is where your eye line is. So that is the line there that goes across. I'll move this on here now so you can just kind of just focus on that. And I might even, if you can see this, put some tracing over it so you can see. So can you see that line there is it's where your eye is. So it just is useful because when you're thinking about all of these lines, the top edge of the building coming down and the bottom edge going up, all of those things meet on the eye line at a point called the vanishing point. Now, you don't need to get into the technicalities of the vanishing point, but it's just a useful thing to know that line is where everything kind of comes down and meets, and at a point on there, which is the vanishing point. What I think is equally important to think about is this idea that, and I'll take that off so you can see carefully, is that it's useful to have, because we're trying to create depth, that is part of perspective, that there is this something close to you and then it goes into the distance. That's important, but it's not just about getting the angles on the building right that creates that feeling of depth. Another thing that I always think is important is having something in the foreground, something in the middle ground, and then something in the background. And the middle ground is the thing that you're interested in. So on this here, the middle ground is the building. The background is what's behind the building, which is this hill. And the foreground are things like this bush and this bin and this. And bear in mind, these things in the foreground will be really a lot bigger than things in the background. So that's important to sort of think about, really. So this car is deceptive because it's really, really big, and the one behind it is tiny. It's not even the same width as the window. So see how they diminish as they go into the distance, and that's important to remember. Okay, so I think those are the kind of key things that we need to think about to draw the framework of the building. There are other things that I want to talk to you about that I'll come back to when we do a second video, where we're talking about the details of things like the windows and the doors and the frames, and how we create a depth and a feeling of 3 dimensions in those details. But for now, we're looking at the overall shapes and edges, and that's what I'm going to demo. Hi everybody, so I just thought I'd go through this first phase, or first stage I should say, fairly carefully. So what I do when I'm doing my colour first is I wet the paper. It's not probably going to drip as much today because I've got it flat, and usually if I'm working at an easel it won't be flat. So the only thing I have done is just marked it into thirds, so I get a kind of an approximate sort of position, sort of right-ish. Not after anything perfect, I'm just after. So at the moment all I'm trying to do is put some dark down, and I'm using Moon Glow and Alizarin Crimson, and I'm just putting the rough shapes in, and I'm trying to, so I'm wetting the paper first. The main thing to do at this stage is to get really rich colour. Beyond anything else is rich colour. And nothing too wishy-washy. I'm going to probably start putting, so this is, probably put that a bit too far over, but it's not, it doesn't matter if it's not exact. I often get asked this, that people think it has to be perfect, and it certainly doesn't. And if you look at mine, often the colour is quite a bit away from where it needs to be. So I want this, and this is probably a bit wet, so I might just move that around a bit. Maybe nothing too drastic. So I want to make sure I kind of get the angle, so I often will hold up my brush like this, and bear in mind that this needs to be still vibrant, it just needs to be much lighter. So I should have cleaned my palette a little bit because I've got some green in my yellow, but so that's what I'm trying to do. And even if it's not perfect, it will be close enough so that it's sort of, so I'm kind of, so I'm doing this third thing, as I sort of mentioned to you before. I'm trying to get quite rich colour. I am quite messy with it, purposely so, because I find that if you try and be too tight, it really doesn't work very well. So, oh, that needs to be yellower. So I'm trying to get a real sort of sense of the vibrancy, and I might have got the, got it far too low down there on that side, but I'm not worried about it. I'm blocking in the big shapes, getting juicy colour, keeping it loose. You want to have the paper quite moist. I didn't spray it today, but I often will spray it. And the only trouble with spraying it is it sometimes makes the paper so wet that it just takes ages to dry. But I'd rather have that than have it too sort of stiff, and then you get loads of brush marks. And I quite like it when it kind of bleeds into each other. Whoops, that's a bit too vigorous there. I'm drying my brush off if it gets too kind of wet. I wanted to kind of get a sort of a sense of the sort of playfulness of that, and so I do sort of shake. Sometimes I shake more than others. Whoops, I nearly chopped the water over there. That wouldn't have been a very good demo, would it? I do put some sky in, but I try not to be too sort of blocky with the sky. I want to put a sense of the sky, but I'm not interested in putting all of the sky in, if that makes sense. And one thing which I just need to make sure that I tell you, because I often forget to say this, is that you don't want colour everywhere. There needs to be white spaces. I don't know if you can see some, but you need to keep breathable space in this approach. Otherwise, it just doesn't work as well. So I would say that I'm going to do a dark green as well. So I use Winsor Green and Alizarin Crimson, and that makes a really nice dark. And actually, I can kind of get that to go into the red, and that kind of merges in quite nicely there. And I'm going to probably stand it up a bit as well. Whoops, that's gone a bit too messy. But that's not, all is not lost with that, because that can be rectified. I can kind of, not come back in with muddy colour. Let me just blot that. It's good when you see it when it goes a little bit harum-scarum, because that's the reality of how these things work. So as long as that's still light and vibrant, I'm happy. So hopefully you can see that I'm actually quite loose with these things. I'm not too precious, and I do use shaking, and I do have drips, and I think I'm just going to leave it there, and then I'm going to come back in and show you stage by stage. But that's essentially the first stage, which is the colour first bit. And I should imagine that you're probably thinking it's a bit messier than you had imagined it was going to be. So I'll come back in and show you the next stage. Thanks. Okay, so this is the piece that I just showed you how to apply the colour onto, and as you can see, there's some nice things happening in between with the colours mixing. Some harsh lines and some sort of bleeding lines, so that's a nice variety. And hopefully you can see that there's some white space, breathable space. So what I'm now going to do is mixing now. So what I'm now going to do is to go in with a contour line and do the broad outline framework. That's the sort of start point really, and then subsequently I will come in with detail. So next up, a rather fast video of the contour drawing.